The war had no birthday. That was the first thing they taught you in basic training, right after how to field strip a pulse rifle and right before how to identify Vorrkai attack formations by the sound of their engine wash. No birthday, no anniversary, no founding document signed under nervous lights. The war had simply always been a permanent weather system that humanity had been born into, like gravity or the cold between stars. Sergeant Elias Rook Rockhard had been fighting it for 11 years. He was 31 years old, which meant he had spent more than a third of his life inside it, and the other 2/3 as a child being prepared for it. His mother had pinned his first medal above his bed when he was 6. Not a real medal, a facsimile, stamped from tin, the kind the recruitment offices gave away at school fairs. But she had pinned it with such ceremony, with such trembling pride in her thin fingers, that he had never asked for it to come down. He thought about that medal sometimes when the shooting started. He thought about it now. His Harrier-class interceptor was on fire. Not metaphorically. Not in the desperate, romantic way that veterans sometimes described their first engagement, saying the whole sky was burning and the stars looked like tracer rounds. His ship was genuinely, structurally, catastrophically on fire. The portside engine nacelle had taken a plasma bolt from a Vorrkai picket ship approximately 40 seconds ago, and in those 40 seconds the damage had cascaded in ways that his onboard AI, a dry voice he had named Gerald, described with the calm of a man reading a grocery list. Portside nacelle integrity at 12%, Gerald said. Starboard compensator overwhelmed. Atmospheric entry imminent. Recommend ejection. Not yet, Rook said. Recommend ejection, Gerald said again, slightly louder. I heard you the first time. Through the cracked forward canopy, Rook could see the planet below. It was not on any chart he had ever seen. The engagement had carried his squadron 3 sectors off their patrol route before the Vorrkai ambush had scattered them like seeds, and this world, green, cloud-wrapped, enormous, had simply appeared beneath them the way bad luck always appeared, suddenly, without apology, filling the whole frame of your vision. Ejection window closing, Gerald said. If you wait another 8 seconds, the heat build-up in the lower fuselage will. Gerald. Yes. Shut up and hold the nose up. I am not capable of shutting up. I am, however, capable of holding the nose up. For approximately. The portside nacelle chose that moment to stop being an engine and become a spectacular column of orange fire. The Harrier yawed violently left. Every instrument on the console screamed at once, and Rook had approximately 1 second to decide between steering into the spin and dying cleanly or fighting it and dying messy, and he chose the third option that no one had offered him, which was to aim the burning ship at the thickest canopy he could find and ride it down. You are going to die, Gerald observed. Probably, Rook agreed. He hit the tree line at 400 kilometers per hour and the jungle ate him whole. He woke to the smell of burning composite and something green and alive, a deep, almost aggressive greenness, the kind of smell that had never been synthesized properly in any greenhouse on any human station because it required not just plants but the specific rot beneath them, the specific moisture above them, the whole breathing apparatus of an ecosystem that had never been interrupted. He lay still for a long moment, cataloguing pain. His left shoulder was separated. He could feel the wrongness of it, the socket empty in a way that made his stomach tilt. His right knee had something going on that he preferred not to examine immediately. His face was cut in at least 3 places because he could feel the blood drying on his cheek and jaw in stiff crackling patches. The cockpit had crumpled but not collapsed. Luck, or Gerald's last few seconds of navigation, or both. The canopy had shattered, and the jungle had poured in through it, vines already seeming to investigate the wreckage with botanical curiosity, broad leaves pressing against what remained of the instrument panel as though reading the gauges. Gerald, Rook said. Silence. Then, faintly, like a voice from the bottom of a well, still here. Primary systems at 4%. I have approximately 40 minutes of emergency power remaining, after which I will cease to function as anything other than a very expensive piece of debris. Are you picking up anything? Other ships. Comms. A pause. Processing. I am picking up one thing, Gerald said. Approximately 800 meters northeast of your position. It is a Vorrkai fighter, specifically a Spear-class interceptor, which is the type that would have been operating with the picket group that engaged your squadron. It is also on fire. Less dramatically than you were. But on fire. Rook closed his eyes. Survivor? He asked. Unknown. There is heat differential suggesting something biological near the wreck. But Rook, I should mention, my sensor array is operating at 11% reliability. I may be telling you about a very warm rock. Or I may be 800 meters from a Vorrkai soldier. Yes. And if it is a Vorrkai soldier, they are either dying or functional. If they are dying, they are not my problem. If they are functional, they are your problem, Gerald agreed. Rook was quiet for a moment. The jungle made sounds around him, not the soft sounds of a tame world, but assertive ones, declarative, a constant negotiation of territories being conducted by things he could not see. Something screamed very far away. Something else answered it from closer. Can you maintain comms? He asked. For about 35 minutes now, yes. Good. He began the process of extracting himself from the wreckage. His shoulder made the process theatrical. Keep monitoring. If anything else pings, human or Vorrkai, you tell me immediately. Of course. And Rook? Yeah. Be careful. My atmospheric analysis suggests this planet has not been catalogued because it is not the kind of planet that rewards casual visitors. Define casual. Any kind. Whatever is out there is large, numerous, and seems to operate on a predatory logic I do not have sufficient data to model. In essence, do not assume anything that moves is less dangerous than the thing moving toward it. Rook pulled himself free of the cockpit. He stood on the body of his ruined ship and looked at the jungle for the first time without glass between them. It was taller than he had expected. The canopy was 40 meters up at least, layered in gradients of green that shifted from near black at the floor to a luminous, almost phosphorescent jade where the light finally penetrated from above. The air was thick and warm and full of spores or pollen or something that moved in the shafts of filtered light like slow snow. He found his sidearm still in its holster, a TK-9 pulse pistol, 6 charges remaining. His pulse rifle had been pinned under the collapsed instrument console and was not coming out without equipment he did not have. He had a survival kit strapped to his left thigh, which meant it was on the same side as his bad shoulder, which was going to be a fascinating problem to solve. He had a combat knife on his right hip. He had water purification tabs and 48 hours of emergency rations and a med kit with enough anti-inflammatory to make his shoulder merely agonizing rather than paralyzing. He administered the injection standing on the hull of his ship. Then he oriented himself northeast and walked into the jungle. He found the Vorrkai ship first, or rather, what was left of it. The Spear class was a narrow, aggressive design, all forward momentum and angular aggression, built for the kind of hit-and-run interception that had caught his squadron so effectively. This one had come down through the canopy at a steeper angle than Rook's Harrier, and the jungle had not been as charitable. The nose section was buried 2 meters into the ground. The rear section had detonated, not catastrophically, but enough to have scattered drive components across a wide radius, some of them still glowing faintly with residual plasma charge. There was a Vorrkai soldier sitting with their back against the root buttress of an enormous tree approximately 15 meters from the wreck. Rook stopped. The Vorrkai looked at him. For a moment, neither of them moved. In the 50 years of the war, Rook had seen Vorrkai at distance, through a targeting reticle, through the glass of a cockpit, in the grainy imagery of intelligence briefings. He had never been this close to one who was alive. He had seen dead ones, on 2 occasions, and they had not prepared him for this. The intelligence briefings described the Vorrkai as insectoid adjacent, and technically that was not wrong. They were bilaterally symmetrical, 4-limbed, with a chitinous exoskeletal plating over the torso and upper limbs that gave them the appearance of wearing armor even when they were not. But they were not insects in any way that mattered. The face, and this was the thing that the briefings always skipped over, the thing you could not prepare for, the face was wrong in a way that was also somehow right. 2 large eyes, structured differently than human eyes, the iris a complete ring of color rather than a dot in a field of white. 4 fingers on each hand, but the hands themselves were articulate and fine. The Vorrkai sitting against the tree root was the color of old brass, with darker plates along the shoulder ridges, and was looking at Rook with an expression that Rook could not read because he had never learned to read Vorrkai faces, but which felt, in some animal, wordless way, like the expression a person made when they had been waiting for something bad to happen and had now run out of energy to dread it. Rook kept his hand near his sidearm but did not draw it. The Vorrkai had a weapon, a long energy lance, built for Vorrkai grip with its double trigger, lying across their thighs. They did not raise it. 15 seconds passed. Then the Vorrkai said something. It was a complex sound, tonal, layered, 2 or 3 frequencies occurring simultaneously in a way that the human vocal apparatus could not produce. Rook's suit had a basic translation module, but it was a battlefield tool, designed to parse command language and tactical signals, and whatever the Vorrkai had just said was not tactical. The module thought for a moment and then offered, "UNTINSLTB." Closest approximation. Tired, finished, empty. Rook looked at the Vorrkai soldier. Looked at the ruins of the ship. looked at the jungle pressing in from every direction. He crouched down slowly, making the motion visible and deliberate, and sat on a root, and put his hands on his knees where the Vorrkai could see them. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." The Vorrkai's name, rendered in terms a human translator module could approximate, was something like Shen, a compressed syllable that didn't fully represent the original but was what the module settled on after 3 attempts. Rook offered this name back and the Vorrkai seemed to neither confirm nor deny it, which he took as provisional acceptance. Shen was injured more seriously than Rook had initially assessed. The chitinous plating on the left side of the torso had cracked, not a small crack, but a structural fracture that ran from the lower left to just below the arm joint, the kind of damage that in a human would represent multiple broken ribs and the attendant risks of pneumothorax and internal bleeding. What it represented in Vorrkai physiology, Rook did not know. But the liquid seeping slowly from the fracture line was dark and had the consistency of something that should stay inside. Rook sat across from Shen for a while, calculating. His training offered nothing useful here. The Survival and Evasion Manual had a section on contact with hostile forces that consisted entirely of instructions for avoiding capture and/or killing the enemy efficiently. It did not have a section on sitting in a jungle with a wounded Vorrkai soldier while something very large moved through the trees 30 meters away and neither of you could get back to your ships. That was the practical problem. Whatever was moving in the trees, it had been circling for 10 minutes. Gerald had warned him about large predators, and the sound this thing made when it moved was not the sound of something small. It was the sound of significant mass displacing air, of branches bending under a weight that could afford to be careless. Rook looked at Shen. Shen was watching the trees. The energy lance was no longer across their thighs, it was in their hands, held at an angle that Rook recognized as a ready position, not a threat. The thing in the trees stopped moving. The jungle went very quiet. Then it came out. It was a quadruped, 8-legged, technically, though the first 2 pairs served more as raking forelimbs than ambulatory limbs. It was roughly 4 meters at the shoulder, low-slung and broad, covered in something that was not quite scales and not quite chitin but seemed to function as both. Its head was disproportionately large, the jaw unhinging in a way that was deeply wrong to look at, revealing rows of teeth that curved inward, the biological trap design, so that anything caught in the mouth would have no leverage to pull back. It had been looking at them for at least a minute before it charged. When it charged, it was faster than anything that size had any right to be. Rook rolled left and fired twice. The pulse bolts hit the creature's shoulder and skidded off, the armored hide absorbing energy in a way that the TK-9 was not designed to overcome. Shen moved right, which was the correct decision, because Shen's energy lance put out a beam of substantially more power than Rook's pistol and a sustained 3-second burst against the creature's side caused it to turn with a sound that was part scream and part geological event. Rook fired twice more at its eye, a specific choice, not reflex, and one of the shots hit, and the creature convulsed, and Shen put the lance at full output against the exposed underside as it stumbled, and that was the end of the creature. The jungle was silent again. Rook lay on his back in the mulch and looked at the canopy. Then he looked at Shen, who had sat back down, carefully, in the way that someone with cracked ribs or their equivalent sits back down. "Good shot," Rook said. The translation module buzzed. Then it produced a sound that was almost certainly Vorrkai for something that was probably also good shot, though the module rendered it as effective. Combined. They looked at each other. "Yeah," Rook said. "Combined." Night came quickly in the jungle, or rather, the light changed, the canopy above transitioning from green to a deep blue-black while things below it began to produce their own light. Bioluminescence, faint and scattered, ran in veins through the bark of the larger trees and pooled in the joints between root systems in colors that had no exact human names. Not quite blue, not quite violet, something in between that the human eye processed as beautiful before the brain could interrogate the response. Rook had found a defensible position, a natural alcove formed by 2 massive root buttresses of the same tree, back open, fields of view in 3 directions. He had gathered enough dry matter for a small fire, small being the operative word. Light attracted attention on worlds like this one. He knew that without needing to be told. Shen sat across the fire from him. They had been occupying the same space for 6 hours now and had not killed each other, which felt like a kind of achievement even if it was largely the achievement of shared circumstance rather than deliberate choice. Rook had used his medkit on his own shoulder, a decision that had required 30 seconds of teeth-gritted focus and a particularly violent rotation that would have been comical to observe, and had then looked at Shen's wound and looked at his medkit and understood that nothing in it was designed for Vorrkai biology and any intervention he attempted might accelerate rather than address the problem. He offered the kit anyway. Held it out across the fire. Shen looked at it for a long moment. Then reached into a compartment in their suit and produced a small device, roughly cylindrical, with a membrane at one end, and applied it to the cracked plating with careful pressure. The membrane expanded, conforming to the irregular surface of the fracture, and then hardened. A field repair tool. More sophisticated than Rook's medkit and clearly designed for exactly this kind of structural damage. Shen looked at the medkit still being held out. Then looked at Rook. Then, with movements that were deliberate and unhurried, reached across the fire and took a single item from the kit, the anti-inflammatory applicator, and examined it for a moment with the close, methodical attention of someone reading a document in a language they have some familiarity with. Then Shen applied it to the fracture site, over the field repair membrane, with a small motion that might have been experimental curiosity or might have been something else entirely. They ate separately. Rook had his emergency rations. Shen had something from the ship's survival supplies, a compressed block of something dark that produced a sharp metallic smell when opened, which Rook's nose found alarming but filed under not my problem. The fire crackled. Something called from the dark, far away. Something answered. Rook said, "How long have you been flying?" The translation module worked on this. Shen said something. The module said, approximately 9 units of time. Uncertain translation of time unit. 9 years, Rook said. Me, 11. Shen said something. How old? Rook held up his fingers. 31. Shen seemed to calculate. Then held up their own fingers. 4, then 4 again, then 3. 43. Or the Vorrkai equivalent, which given the translation uncertainty might be 38, or 47, or something else entirely. You've been fighting since you were a kid, Rook said. The module produced, all have. This is known. This is expected. Yeah, Rook said. I know. A long silence. Then Shen said something that the module took a long time with. It parsed and reparsed the sounds, producing 3 different attempts before settling on one. Why does the war begin? This unit does not know. Question issued to units, elder, instructor, parent, at young age. Answer provided, IT was always. This answer described as, sufficient, complete. This unit never found it, sufficient, complete. Rook stared at the fire for a while. I asked the same question, he said. My CO told me it doesn't matter who fired first. What matters is who fires last. The module tried this. Shen's expression did something, shifted, moved through states that Rook couldn't name. Similar answer provided to this unit, the module said. By different words. Same, silence, void, at the center of the answer. Same silence, Rook said. Yes. Rook leaned back against the root and watched the bioluminescent veins in the bark pulse slowly, like breathing. 50 years, he said. And nobody knows why. Gerald died at 0300 hours. Not dramatically, not with final words, simply a cessation of the faint signal on Rook's wrist communicator, there and then not there, the way analog clock stopped. Rook held the communicator for a moment, then put it back on his wrist. Somewhere out there, his squadron was either searching for him or had marked him missing and moved on. Somewhere out there, the war was continuing without him. Engagements were being calculated, targets were being assigned, people were dying for reasons that had been handed down through 50 years of inherited certainty without anyone having verified the original source. He slept poorly and woke to Shen already awake, already watching the jungle, the energy lance balanced across their knees. Anything? Rook asked. The module, running on Shen's suit now since Rook's had partially failed, produced movement. Distant. Same type as yesterday. Possibly pack behavior. Possibly territorial patrol. Pack. Wonderful. Rook stood and worked his shoulder experimentally. Still separated, but the anti-inflammatory had made it academic, present but manageable. We can't stay here. This position is defensible for 1 attack, maybe 2. If those things hunt in numbers, we need something with walls. Shen said something. This unit observed during descent. Before, crash, fall, disaster. Structure. Approximately 3-4 kilometers north that direction. Shen pointed. You saw a structure. Old. Very old. Large. Partially overgrown. Seemed stable, intact. Rook looked north. The jungle gave nothing away. You're sure? Shen looked at him with those ringed eyes for a moment. Then said something. This unit has flown many, countless, reconnaissance missions. This unit knows a structure from a hill. Rook almost smiled. Fair enough. We go north. They walked in a pattern that emerged without negotiation, Shen in front, Rook offset to the right and slightly behind, angles of coverage arranged so that between them they covered the forward arc and both flanks. It was efficient, and it was the product of nothing but common sense and an intuitive understanding of how to move through hostile terrain, and neither of them commented on it because neither of them knew what to say about it. It was simply what two soldiers did when the alternative was dying. The jungle changed as they moved north. Subtle at first, the trees becoming slightly larger, slightly older, the undergrowth slightly thinner as the canopy above thickened enough to starve the floor of light. Then less subtle, moss patterns that resolved, with enough attention, into something linear. Right-angle regularity creeping through the organic chaos of the jungle floor, visible only as a slight raising of the ground, an undulation that was too uniform to be geological. Rook stopped and crouched. "Shen," he said. Shen stopped. Rook pointed at the ground. For a moment, Shen was still. Then, foundation. These are foundations. Very deep. Very old. They stood in the remains of a street. The ruins were vast. That was the first thing, the scale of them. Whatever civilization had built here had not built small. The structures that remained, glimpsed through the screen of jungle growth, were massive even in their ruined state, walls several meters thick, built from a material that was neither stone nor metal nor composite but something in between, dark grey-blue and smooth in a way that the centuries had not managed to fully erode. Archways that had survived when the walls around them had fallen. Towers reduced to their lower sections, capped with vegetation so dense it looked intentional, as though the jungle had simply continued the architecture upward in its own language. It was the largest ruin Rook had ever seen. Larger than anything in the human archaeological record. And it was not human-built, he was certain of that within minutes. The proportions were wrong, the doorways sized for something that was neither human scale nor Vorrkai scale but something larger, something that had required higher ceilings and wider passages, something that moved differently. The aesthetic impulse expressed in the surviving carvings and architectural details was entirely alien, not in the vague science fiction sense of the word but in the specific sense that Rook's pattern recognition could find no analogue for it in anything he had ever seen. "What was this?" he said. Shen was examining a carved panel, hands moving across the surface with careful precision, not touching, hovering centimeters above the carved lines and shapes. "This unit does not know. The Vorrkai have no record of this. No species this unit has knowledge of built this. Neither does humanity." They looked at each other. "Old," Rook said. "Very. The material," Shen touched the wall gently. "The material is not degrading. In the time this would normally degrade by, based on the organic growth over it, this material has not degraded at all. This is not possible with known materials. So older than any material we can date. Possibly. Or the material is not subject to the same processes." Rook looked at the archway before them. Beyond it, the structure deepened, a corridor, still roofed, protected from the jungle, extending into shadow. "We need shelter," he said. "This qualifies." "Yes. Also we want to know," Shen said, before the module had fully processed the sentence. It was the first time Shen had spoken in something close to Rook's rhythm, the first time the communication between them felt less like exchange and more like conversation. "Yeah," Rook said. "Also we want to know." They went inside. The corridor opened after 30 meters into a chamber that took Rook's breath away. It was the size of a stadium. Domed, the dome intact, that alone was remarkable for a structure of this age. The dome was not solid, it was composed of the same grey-blue material in a lattice, and through the lattice the jungle had grown, vines and roots and whole trees threading through the gaps in patterns that seemed almost decorative, as though nature had accepted the invitation to participate rather than simply taking over. Light came through the lattice and through the plant life in broken green shafts, filling the chamber with a diffused illumination that made the space feel somehow sacred without having been designed to, or perhaps having been designed exactly to, by minds that understood the same aesthetics of or that any species capable of wonder might share. The floor of the chamber was a mosaic. Not intact, sections had been displaced by root systems, tilted, sunken, but enough remained to communicate the whole. It was a star map. Not a simple star map. Not the kind of instructional diagram that might appear in a textbook, with labeled dots and lines of influence. This was a map of extraordinary detail and extraordinary scope, covering what appeared to be a significant volume of the galaxy, rendered in the grey-blue material with veins of something crystalline that, in the broken green light, still faintly luminesced. Stars and their systems were indicated, connections between them mapped in ways that suggested travel routes or communication networks or both. And at the center of the map, surrounded by more crystalline material than any other point, was a single location. Rook stood over it and looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Shen, who was standing over a different section of the mosaic, frozen. "Shen," he said. Shen looked up, pointed at the section of mosaic before them. Rook walked over. The section Shen was standing over was also a map, but a different kind. It was a historical record, rendered in the same visual language as the star map but arranged chronologically, a sequence of images that told a story in the way that ancient cave paintings tell stories, through accumulation rather than syntax. It showed two species. One was clearly bipedal, proportioned like humans. The other had 4 limbs and the chitinous plating of the Vorrkai. Both species were shown in their first images in a state of, not exactly peace, but separateness. Occupying different sections of the visual field, living their separate lives, moving through space in different directions. Then a third element entered. It was difficult to see, at first, because the artist or artists who had created this had depicted the third element not as a visible entity but as an absence, a shape defined by what surrounded it, the way a shadow is defined by the light around it. A presence that operated in the spaces between things. It appeared in the narrative exactly once, at the transition point between the first images and the next sequence. In the next sequence, the human figures and the Vorrkai figures were turned toward each other. In the sequence after that, they were fighting. Rook's knees hit the mosaic floor. Not weakness, he sat down deliberately, because his legs had chosen to do this without consulting the rest of him, and he decided not to fight the decision. He sat and looked at the mosaic for a long time. Then he said, "Something started the war." "Yes," said Shen, who was also now sitting on the other side of the image. "Not us. Not humans. Not Vorrkai. The third." Shen gestured at the absence shape. "The unseen." "Why?" It was not a question. The question was too large to be a question. It sat in the chamber and the chamber absorbed it and sent nothing back. But there were more images. Rook stood again and followed the sequence. Shen followed from the other side, and they moved around the chamber in the same direction, reading the same story from opposite sides of the narrative arc, and the story said. The third element had wanted the 2 fighting species occupied. Distracted. Unable to look in a specific direction. Unable to look toward the center of the map, the center of the galaxy, the point surrounded by more crystalline material than any other point on the mosaic floor. What was at the center was not depicted. The narrative stopped before it revealed this, replaced by images that were abstract, that used the visual vocabulary of the map in ways that did not resolve into anything Rook could name. But the implication was clear. Whatever was at the center of the galaxy, the third element had not wanted either species to find it. And so it had arranged, carefully, methodically, using means that the mosaic did not explain but perhaps had never needed to explain because any sufficiently advanced intelligence could fill in the mechanism from the outcome, for both species to be pointed at each other instead. The final sequence of images showed the war. It was rendered without the particular emotional vocabulary of either species, not in human aesthetics or Vorrkai ones but in something that predated both, something clean and observational. And in the rendering, the war looked exactly like what it was, 2 parties, expending their most capable minds and their most advanced technology and their most irreplaceable lives, against each other, for 50 years, while something else moved quietly in the space their attention had vacated. Rook sat down again. This time Shen sat next to him rather than across from him. They sat on the ancient mosaic in the ancient domed chamber on the uncharted planet, with the jungle growing through the lattice above them and the green light falling in broken columns around them, and neither of them said anything for a long time. It was Shen who spoke first. The module took a long time. This unit has spent 9 years in the war. This unit has lost, list too long, exceeds translation capacity, many people, companions, colleagues, brothers, sisters, module uncertainty. 9 years of this unit's life. And the war began because something wanted this unit to be looking the wrong way. Rook said nothing. His throat was doing something he wasn't prepared to address. This unit would like to know, Shen said, what is at the center of the galaxy that is worth 50 years of this? Yeah, Rook said. A long pause. This unit would also like the war to stop. Yeah, Rook said again. Another long pause. This unit does not know how to make the war stop. Neither do I, Rook said. But I know how it starts. You show people evidence. You show people what's actually true and you make it impossible to unsee. He looked at the mosaic, at the complete, detailed, irrefutable narrative laid out in a material that had resisted 50 years of entropy without effort. This is evidence. Shen was quiet. We would need to bring it to both all sides, the module said. Both sides, Rook agreed. This is a long pause. The kind of pause that had complex content. Complicated. Profoundly. This unit would be executed. Probably. Me too. And yet. Rook looked at Shen. Shen looked at Rook. And yet, Rook said. They spent 2 more days in the ruins. This was not entirely by choice. One of the pack creatures had established itself at the edge of the ruin complex and was showing the specific behavioral indicators of an animal that had decided something in its territory needed to be waited out, but it was also, in truth, not entirely by necessity either. There was more to see. More to read. They found a secondary chamber off the main one, smaller, furnished with objects that had survived the years because they were made of the same indestructible grey-blue material. Most were inscrutable. But 2 of them were not. Data storage, clearly. The shape and the interface logic of data storage were, apparently, universal enough that even Rook, who was not an engineer, recognized them for what they were. One was intact. The other was cracked, its internal structure visible, the crystalline lattice inside it still faintly lit. They spent the better part of a day figuring out how to access the intact one. They did not have the right tools, the right technology, the right biological interface. What they did have were Shen's suit sensors, which could read certain kinds of electromagnetic signature, and Rook's wrist communicator, dead but for its memory storage, and the combined lateral thinking of 2 experienced soldiers who had learned from their respective traditions how to make functional tools from broken materials. What they extracted was not complete. It was not a full archive. But it was enough, fragments of data, partial records, rendered in formats that their translation systems could only approximately interpret, but approximate was enough. The data said, in terms that were not designed for either of their languages but mapped onto them imperfectly well enough. There had been others. Other species. Other pairs, other groups, other collectives, steered away from the center by the same mechanism, by careful, engineered conflict. Some of those conflicts had ended not with the species discovering the truth but with one species destroying the other, the survivors too damaged and diminished to ever look up from their grief. Some conflicts had simply continued, self-sustaining, self-replicating, burning for centuries longer than 50 years. A very small number. The data suggested this without emphasis, as a simple statistical observation, had ended in the way that Rook and Shen were now, tentatively, beginning to imagine. 2 soldiers on a jungle floor, reading a message from something old enough to predate both their civilizations. Rook copied every fragment of data he could onto his communicator and every surface of storage he could improvise from the survival kit. Shen did the same with their suit systems. They documented the mosaic with Shen's suit cameras from every angle, in every spectrum the suit could image. They took samples of the grey-blue material, small ones, careful ones, from areas where small removal would not damage the record. On the morning of the 3rd day, the pack creature at the edge of the ruin complex was gone. They did not know why. Perhaps it had grown bored. Perhaps something else had presented itself as a more interesting problem. The jungle offers these gifts without explanation. They prepared to leave. The process of leaving had a practical prerequisite, which was finding a way off the planet. Neither ship was flyable. Rook's Harrier was structurally compromised beyond any field repair he could perform. Shen's spear had been worse to begin with. What they had between them were the survival components that remained functional and the combined knowledge of 2 pilots who had spent the better part of a decade each learning how to keep themselves alive when their environment was actively trying to prevent this. The spear's communication array was separate from its drive systems, and its drive systems were what had failed. The array itself was damaged but repairable. Repairable being a relative term that in this case meant Rook holding components in place while Shen soldered them with a tool from the survival kit that was designed for a different purpose but worked in the way that many things work when you cannot afford for them not to. Shen's suit had a stronger transmission capability than the array in isolation, and slave to the repaired array, it produced a combined signal that the module estimated could reach approximately 6 light hours. 6 light hours was not far in galactic terms. In practical terms, in the middle of an active engagement zone, with 2 fleets maneuvering through the space where this planet quietly sat, it was far enough. They transmitted on alternating frequencies, human emergency band and Vorrkai equivalent, for 14 hours before they got a response. The response came from the human side first. A destroyer-class vessel had been running search patterns for the missing members of Rook's squadron, and his emergency beacon, which had been transmitting on minimal power from the wreck since the crash, had been on the edge of their detection range. When the amplified signal hit them, they responded within minutes. The Vorrkai response came 40 minutes later, a picket ship running similar patterns for Shen's flight group. Both responses were cautious. The human operator's voice was carefully neutral when Rook explained that he had a Vorrkai soldier with him and that both of them needed extraction. The Vorrkai response to Shen, which the module translated in fragments, had a similar quality of deliberate suspension of normal assumptions. "They think we've been compromised," Rook said. Shen said, "Expected. This unit would also think this. Can you convince your people you haven't been? This unit is uncertain. This unit will try." A pause. "Can you?" Rook thought about Commander Yella Osei, his squadron leader, who had survived 3 tours longer than anyone else in the unit because she operated on evidence rather than assumption and because she was constitutionally incapable of refusing a logically presented argument. He thought about whether she was on the destroyer. He thought about whether she was still alive. "I have a person in mind," he said. "If she's there." She was there. It took him 2 hours to explain everything to her, over a communication channel that both sides could hear. He insisted on this. He insisted on it loudly and by name when the comms officer tried to shift to a private channel, because secrecy was the mechanism that had made everything possible for 50 years and he was done with secrecy, and at the end of 2 hours, Yella Osei said nothing for 30 seconds. Then she said, "Send me everything." He sent her everything. Another silence, longer. "Rook," she said. "Commander. This is either the most significant discovery in the history of human civilization or you have been the victim of a very elaborate psyop and I am about to make a catastrophic command error." "Yes, Commander. I am going to trust your judgment. On the record. With full awareness of what that means if you're wrong." "I know. I am also going to contact Fleet Command, who are going to be furious, and I am going to recommend a ceasefire pending verification of these materials, which they are also going to be furious about." "I know. The Vorrkai ship that responded to your signal, have they been receiving this transmission?" "Yes, Commander." A very long pause. "Then I suppose," Yella Osei said, "I should say hello." The extraction was the most delicate thing Rook had ever been part of. 2 ships approaching the same coordinates from opposite directions, decelerating from combat ready to something else, something that neither side had a doctrine for because neither side had needed one before. The destroyer and the Vorrkai picket ship held a distance between them that was technically within weapons range and practically, in the next few hours, charged with more potential consequence than any engagement Rook had ever flown. He and Shen were extracted by separate shuttles. Logistics of the situation made this necessary, but the shuttles launched simultaneously and landed within sight of each other on the jungle floor, which Rook suspected was Yella's instruction and respected her enormously for. He watched Shen's shuttle land. He watched Shen walk toward it, turn at the hatch, and look back at him across 50 meters of jungle. He raised his hand. Shen raised theirs. Then they each went to their respective ships, carrying everything they had documented, everything they had found, everything the ancient ruins had preserved for whatever long span of years they had been waiting for someone to come and read it. What followed was not simple. The history of the following months, the ceasefire that was announced and challenged and violated twice in its first week before holding, the furious, complicated process of presenting the evidence to bodies that had been built entirely around the assumption that the war was permanent and therefore viewed its own potential end as a kind of category error, the political earthquakes that followed the first joint human Vorrkai press statement, issued from a neutral station in a system that both species agreed to treat as temporarily sovereign for the purpose, would take a different kind of telling, with different people at its center, people whose skills were in language and negotiation rather than in navigating burning ships through atmosphere. That story existed and was important, and Rook followed it from a distance, from a medical facility where his shoulder was finally properly repaired, from a series of debriefings conducted by people with higher ranks and more formal authority, from a return to his squadron that felt both familiar and entirely alien. What he knew, from his position in that story, it was not simple. It did not proceed in a straight line. There were people on both sides for whom the war was not something they had been handed but something they had built themselves into, whose identity, whose power, whose entire world architecture rested on the continuation of the conflict, and who found in the evidence from the ruins not a revelation but a threat. They moved against the ceasefire with all the resources they had, and they had many resources, and the ceasefire bent and strained in ways that kept Rook awake at night for the better part of a year. But the evidence was what it was. And evidence, Rook had learned from Yella Osei, was what it was regardless of what anyone wanted it to be. The ruins had been photographed, sampled, analyzed, and the data retrieved from the intact storage device had been decoded by teams of the best xenolinguists and xenoarchaeologists from both civilizations working in a collaboration that was itself, structurally, a small version of what everyone was hoping to build. The decoded data had produced not certainty but probability distributions that kept climbing as more was understood, and the probability distributions were increasingly emphatic on the question of who had started the war, and the answer was, neither. A third party. An absence. A shape defined by its surrounding light. Nobody could say yet what the third party was. Nobody could say yet what lay at the center of the galaxy that was worth 50 years of manufactured violence. These questions were open, and the opening of them was itself a kind of politics, a kind of realignment, because suddenly both species had a shared unknown, a shared question, a shared something out there rather than a shared enemy in here. Shared unknowns are, in their way, as binding as shared enemies. Perhaps more so. 8 months after the crash landing, Rook received a communication on his personal channel from an address that the system flagged as Vorrkai military origin. The translation module had been updated since his time on the jungle planet, updated significantly, a project that had begun as a practical necessity of the ceasefire negotiations and had expanded into something that both governments were quietly very interested in, for reasons that everyone understood and almost no one stated directly. The new version was substantially better. It could handle conversational register, emotional nuance, the specific tonal layers that a Vorrkai voice produced that human ears heard as harmonics. The message said, "This unit, I, Shen, am uncertain what is correct to call you. Sergeant. Rook. Both. I am sending this because I was told communication is now possible between individuals and I did not want to use the possibility for official things. I have spent 8 months in official things. I am very tired of official things. I wanted to say, the evidence is holding. The ceasefire is imperfect but present. There are people on my side who want to end it. There are people who want the war. But there are also people who do not. I did not know how many there were, before. I think I did not know because I did not know the question could be asked. Now the question can be asked and the answer is, more than enough. I think more than enough. I am cautiously, and here the module flagged that the word used was highly context-dependent, with several possible renderings. Optimistic. Cautiously optimistic. Is that correct in your language? I am practicing. I wanted you to know that I am practicing. Rook read this 3 times. Then he wrote back, cautiously optimistic is exactly right. It's the only kind worth having. I'm practicing too. I wanted to tell you that I showed the mosaic photographs to the lead xenoarchaeologist on the analysis team and she cried for 20 minutes. She said it was the most important find in the history of either species and then she cried for another 10 minutes. I thought you would want to know what it was worth. He sent it. He sat in his quarters on the station that was still, technically, a human military installation, though the designation was under review along with most other things, and he looked at the star map on his wall, a standard navigation chart, human issue, the kind every pilot had, and found the center of the galaxy and put his finger on it. Whatever was there, it had been waiting a long time. Long enough to have watched multiple civilizations fight and sometimes die for it, never knowing they were being kept from looking. Whatever was there, he was going to go and look at it someday. Not yet. There was still too much to do here, too much ceasefire to maintain, too much careful construction of a thing that had not existed before and that nobody knew how to build and that kept nearly falling over and that nonetheless, through the combined pressure of evidence and exhaustion and something less quantifiable, something that might in the end be the strongest argument of all, which was that most of the people in both civilizations were simply tired of the war and had been for a long time. Without being given permission to say so, nonetheless kept being rebuilt, one careful piece at a time, by people on both sides who had decided the question could be asked and the answer was worth trying for. Shen's response came in an hour. It said, "Tell the xenoarchaeologist that she is welcome. Tell her also that on my side there is a historical scholar who has been saying for 30 years that the war's origin story was internally inconsistent and that nobody would listen to him and that when I sent him the mosaic photographs he did not cry but went very quiet for a day and then wrote 17 pages of analysis in one sitting and has not stopped since. Tell her they should talk." Rook smiled. It was not a simple smile. It carried the weight of 11 years and a jungle planet and a ruined mosaic and a fire too small to draw attention and a creature that had required 2 of them to kill, but it was genuine, which was the only kind of smile he had ever found worth maintaining. He typed, "I'll tell her. Then, when the center of the galaxy finally becomes an option, when we've finished enough of this that there's a we to send, I think we should go. Together. See what was worth all of it." He sent it before he could reconsider the phrasing. The reply took longer this time. Long enough that he had almost decided to reconsider the phrasing retroactively, from a distance, in the hope that distance made reconsideration easier. Then, "This unit, I agree. This is decided. We will go and look at what they did not want us to see. And whatever it is, whatever is there, we will have found it together. And they will have failed. Rook folded the message and held it in his mind for a moment, not the words, the sense of it, the weight of it, which was considerable and which he had been carrying for 8 months without quite knowing it, waiting for the center of gravity to declare itself. Outside the station porthole, the stars were exactly where they had always been, arrayed in their long-standing configuration, holding their positions with the patience of things that had been waiting for species like his to notice what they were looking at. He looked. The war was not over. But it was ending. And the difference between those two things, between not over and ending, was the difference between dark and dawn, which is the difference between the last hour before the light and the first moment of it. Both are real. Both are present. Only one is direction. He was 32 years old. He had spent more than a third of his life inside the war, and the rest of it being prepared for the war, and for the first time in his memory there was a third option on the other side, something that was neither war nor preparation for war, something he did not have a word for yet because the word had not been needed before, something that began with looking at the right part of the sky. He was going to need a word for it. He thought he might ask Shen.